The champagne flutes were already filled and gleaming under the string lights when I saw my mother Linda rise from her seat at the head table. My fiancé Ryan had just finished his heartfelt toast about our future together, and the 75 guests at Lakeway Resort were still applauding, their faces warm with genuine happiness for us. I was holding my own glass, ready to announce our June wedding date and share the excitement that had been building in my chest all evening. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's when Mom tapped her fork against her crystal glass with that particular rhythm. That meant she had something important to say. Before Jessica says anything, she began, her voice carrying across the lakeside pavilion with practiced authority. I have the most wonderful news that I simply cannot keep to myself any longer. The guests turned toward her expectantly, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Our beautiful Victoria is expecting her first baby. The eruption of cheers and congratulations that followed seemed to echo off the lake itself. My sister Tori, who had been sitting quietly beside her husband David at the family table, suddenly found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Aunt Patricia was already crying happy tears, Uncle Michael was shaking David's hand like he'd just won the lottery, and my cousin Ashley was squealing with excitement. Even Ryan's parents, Helen and James, were beaming and offering their congratulations to my sister. Within moments, what had been my engagement celebration had transformed into Tori's pregnancy announcement party. I stood there in my carefully chosen navy dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this moment, watching as the photographer I'd hired began snapping pictures of Tori's glowing face. The cake behind her, decorated with "Congratulations Jessica and Ryan" in elegant gold script, became the backdrop for pregnancy photos I'd inadvertently funded. Ryan reached for my hand under the table, his fingers finding mine in a gentle squeeze that said he understood exactly what had just happened. But what my family didn't know, what nobody in that pavilion could have possibly guessed, was that I had news of my own. News that would change everything they thought they knew about quiet, dependable Jessica Martinez. 3 weeks earlier, Nexus Media Group had made an offer for my digital marketing company that I'd been afraid to believe was real. The acquisition was finalized just 2 days ago, and the amount sitting in my business account was a number I'd only ever dreamed about. Growing up in Cedar Park, I learned early that in the Martinez family, there were unspoken rules about who got attention and who provided it. Tori was 3 years younger than me, born with the kind of effortless charm that made adults smile indulgently at her mistakes, while my successes were met with brief nods of acknowledgement. She had inherited Mom's dramatic flair and Dad's easy laugh, while I seemed to have gotten the more practical genes that made me naturally good at organizing, planning, and making things work. In elementary school, when Tori forgot her lunch money, I would share mine without being asked. When she cried about a difficult math assignment, I would sit with her for hours until she understood, even if it meant staying up past my own bedtime. By middle school, the pattern was so established that teachers would automatically pair us together, knowing I would help her succeed. It wasn't that my parents deliberately favored her, but rather that Tori's needs always seemed more urgent, more immediate, while my steady performance was something they could count on without worry. High school amplified these differences. While I was studying for AP exams and filling out scholarship applications, Tori was homecoming princess, dating the captain of the football team, and floating through her classes with grades that were just good enough to keep her eligible for cheerleading. When college acceptance letters arrived, I had earned a partial academic scholarship to the University of Texas at Austin. Tori enrolled at the local community college, changed her major 3 times, and eventually dropped out after 2 semesters to pursue what she called real-world experience. At UT, I discovered I had a natural talent for understanding how businesses could use social media to connect with customers. While my dormmates were rushing sororities and planning spring break trips, I was interning at a small marketing firm downtown and teaching myself everything I could about digital strategy. By my junior year, I was freelancing for local businesses, helping them navigate the rapidly changing world of online marketing. My parents would ask politely about my studies when I called home, but the conversations always seemed to drift to Tori's latest job at a boutique in the mall, or her new boyfriend, who played guitar in a band. After graduation, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of accepting a comfortable position at an established advertising agency, I used my savings to start Amplified Digital Marketing. I rented a tiny office space in a co-working building in the Domain, bought used furniture from Craigslist, and spent my days cold calling small businesses and tech startups, explaining how social media could transform their customer engagement. The first year was brutal. I lived on ramen noodles and coffee, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that needed constant repairs, and worked 18-hour days trying to prove that my vision could become reality. Mom and Dad visited my office exactly once during those early days. Dad walked around the small space, noting the industrial ceiling and concrete floors, with the same expression he'd worn when inspecting construction sites during his foreman days. Mom sat delicately on my secondhand couch and asked when I planned to get a real job with benefits and security. Neither of them understood why I would choose uncertainty over safety, why I would risk financial stability for something as intangible as building my own company. They'd raised me to be practical, and from their perspective, entrepreneurship looked dangerously impractical. But I had inherited something from Dad's construction background that they hadn't anticipated: the ability to see a finished project when others could only see an empty lot. Every late night, every rejected proposal, every month when I wasn't sure I could make rent was an investment in something larger than myself. I was building not just a business, but proof that the quiet Martinez daughter had vision and determination that extended far beyond organizing family gatherings and helping her sister with homework. The breakthrough came during my third year when I landed a contract with a tech startup called Innovate Tech. They were developing an app for small business inventory management, and their founders were brilliant engineers who had no idea how to explain their product to potential customers. I created a social media campaign that translated their technical innovation into stories that resonated with busy restaurant owners and retail managers. Within 6 months, their user base had grown from a few hundred to over 50,000, and they credited my marketing strategy as a key factor in their success. Word spread quickly through Austin's tight-knit startup community. Soon, I was working with software developers, food tech companies, and clean energy ventures, helping each one find their unique voice in an increasingly crowded digital marketplace. I hired my first employee, then my second, then moved to a larger office space with actual conference rooms and ergonomic chairs. My client roster grew to include companies that had begun as small startups and evolved into million-dollar enterprises. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was helping other people's businesses grow and succeed, my own family remained largely unaware of what I was actually doing. They knew I worked with computers and that I seemed to be doing well enough to afford a nice apartment in South Austin, but the specifics of my work remained mysterious to them. During family dinners, Dad would ask how business was going with the same tone he might use to inquire about the weather, while Mom would mention that Tori was thinking about getting her real estate license or maybe taking a course in medical billing. It was Tori who met David at one of those family dinners. He was the nephew of our neighbors, visiting from Houston, where he worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm. He was steady, reliable, and clearly smitten with Tori's vivacious personality. Within 6 months, they were engaged, and within a year, they were married in a ceremony at the Cedar Park Community Center that featured all of Mom's favorite flowers and Dad's carefully constructed wooden arch. I was maid of honor, of course, helping to coordinate vendors and manage the timeline, while Tori focused on being the radiant bride. Their marriage settled into a comfortable routine that seemed to satisfy everyone. David provided the stability that Tori had never been particularly interested in creating for herself, while she brought spontaneity and fun to his previously ordered life. They rented a modest house in Round Rock, close enough to visit family regularly but far enough away to establish their own traditions. Tori tried various jobs, working at a yoga studio, then a high-end cosmetics store, then as a personal assistant to a local real estate agent. None of these positions lasted longer than a year, but David's steady income meant she could explore her interests without financial pressure. Meanwhile, my business continued to grow in ways that surprised even me. The success with Innovate Tech had led to referrals to other startups, and my reputation for understanding both technology and human psychology made me increasingly valuable to companies trying to navigate digital transformation. I developed proprietary methods for measuring engagement authenticity, created templates for crisis communication that other marketing firms began copying, and spoke at conferences where audience members took notes on every word I said. The offer from Nexus Media Group came out of nowhere. They were a national marketing conglomerate looking to expand their digital services, and they'd been watching my work with Austin startups for over a year. The initial conversation was supposed to be about a consulting contract, but as we discussed my methods and client results, the conversation shifted to something much larger. They wanted to acquire Amplified Digital Marketing entirely, bringing my team and my processes under their corporate umbrella while allowing me to maintain creative control as Director of Innovation. The number they offered was beyond anything I'd imagined when I was eating ramen in my tiny first office. It represented not just financial security but validation, that the vision I'd been building toward for 5 years was actually worth something substantial to people who understood the industry. More than that, it meant I could continue doing the work I loved while having resources and support that would let me take on even more ambitious projects. I'd been sitting on this news for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it with Ryan first, then with my family. The engagement party seemed perfect, a celebration where good news could be shared and multiplied among people who cared about us. I'd imagined Ryan's proud smile when I finally revealed how far my computer work had actually taken me. I'd pictured Dad's face when he realized that his practical daughter had built something more substantial than he'd ever constructed. I'd hoped that Mom might finally understand that my choice to start my own business hadn't been impractical after all, but rather the most practical decision I'd ever made. Instead, I found myself standing in the lakeside pavilion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Pavilion. Watching my sister accept congratulations for news that had nothing to do with achievement or hard work, but rather with biology and timing. The photographer was still taking pictures of Tori and David, capturing their happiness against the backdrop of decorations I'd chosen and paid for. Guests were already talking about baby showers and nursery themes, their attention completely diverted from the engagement celebration we'd originally gathered to share. Ryan leaned close to my ear, his voice barely audible over the continued congratulations surrounding my sister. "You know you can still make your announcement," he said gently. "People can be happy about multiple things at once." But I wasn't ready to share that spotlight again, wasn't prepared to have my professional triumph treated as an afterthought to someone else's personal news. For once in my life, I wanted to control the timing of my own revelation, to choose the moment when my family would finally understand who I'd become while they weren't paying attention. What they didn't know was that Tori's pregnancy announcement had just given me the perfect setup for news that would change everything they thought they understood about the Martinez family hierarchy. The applause for Tori's pregnancy announcement seemed to stretch on forever, each clap echoing across the lake like a reminder of what had just happened. I watched as Uncle Michael pulled out his phone to call his other children, announcing that they were going to be cousins to a new baby. Aunt Patricia was already discussing baby shower themes with Mom, their voices animated with the kind of excitement that I'd hoped would be directed toward my engagement. Even the catering staff had paused their dinner service to join in the celebration, their professional smiles genuine as they offered congratulations to my sister. Ryan's grip on my hand tightened slightly, a silent anchor in the chaos of redirected attention. I could see the confusion in his eyes, mixed with something that might have been anger on my behalf. He'd spent months planning this evening with me, helping me choose the venue, taste-testing appetizers, and ensuring that every detail would create the perfect atmosphere for celebrating our future together. Now he was watching that carefully orchestrated celebration transform into something entirely different, and I could tell he was struggling with how to respond. David, Tori's husband, looked as surprised as anyone by the announcement. He kept glancing between my sister and my mother with an expression that suggested this wasn't something they'd planned together. When our cousin Ashley asked him about due dates and doctor appointments, he answered with the vague responses of someone who was still processing the information himself. It occurred to me that Mom might have taken it upon herself to announce news that wasn't quite ready to be shared, turning my engagement party into the launching pad for Tori's pregnancy journey whether my sister had intended it or not. But what struck me most wasn't the appropriation of my celebration, though that stung more than I wanted to admit. It was the familiar pattern that was already emerging in the aftermath of Mom's announcement. Within minutes, the conversation had shifted from congratulating Ryan and me on our engagement to discussing how the family could support Tori through her pregnancy. Dad was already calculating costs, mentioning that babies were expensive and that Tori and David might need help with medical bills and baby gear. Mom was making lists in her head, I could tell, already planning the ways she could be involved in every aspect of her future grandchild's life. The most painful part was watching how naturally everyone slipped into their established roles. Tori became the center of attention, graciously accepting advice and offers of help with the practiced ease of someone who'd been the family focal point for most of her life. David stood beside her, looking proud but slightly overwhelmed by the sudden intensity of Martina's family involvement. Mom and Dad transformed into protective grandparents-to-be, already discussing how they could rearrange their lives to provide maximum support for their daughter and future grandchild. And me? I found myself automatically shifting into the background, the reliable daughter who could be counted on to understand that family priorities had just been reshuffled. Several guests approached me to offer congratulations on becoming an aunt, as if my primary role in this moment was to be excited about someone else's pregnancy rather than celebrate it for my own life milestone. I smiled and nodded and said all the appropriate things about how thrilled I was for Tori, because that's what the responsible sister does when family dynamics require it. Ryan was watching me carefully, and I could see him trying to decide whether to intervene. He'd been part of the Martinez family dynamic long enough to understand how these patterns worked, but he'd never seen them play out quite so dramatically at an event specifically meant to celebrate our relationship. When his own parents approached us to offer congratulations on the pregnancy news, assuming we'd been part of the planning process, Ryan politely corrected them and redirected the conversation back to our engagement. But even Helen and James Thompson, well-meaning as they were, seemed more excited about the prospect of a baby in the extended family than they were about discussing wedding plans. The dinner service continued around us, but the evening's focus had fundamentally shifted. Tables that had been arranged to facilitate conversations about our upcoming wedding were now buzzing with discussions about baby names, nursery themes, and the logistics of supporting new parents. The photographer I'd hired was still taking pictures, but they were predominantly of Tori and David, surrounded by well-wishers, with occasional shots of the larger group that happened to include Ryan and me at the edges of the frame. I excused myself from the table and walked to the lakeside railing, needing a moment to process what had just happened and figure out how to respond. The view across the water was beautiful, with the last light of sunset reflecting off the surface, and the lights of lakeside homes beginning to twinkle in the distance. It was exactly the kind of romantic setting I'd imagined, for announcing our wedding date, for sharing our excitement about building a life together, for introducing Ryan's family more formally to mine in an atmosphere of celebration and joy. Instead, I found myself standing alone at the railing, listening to my engagement party continue behind me as a pregnancy celebration. I could hear Mom's voice rising above the others as she shared stories about her own pregnancies, offering advice to Tori about everything from morning sickness remedies to the best local obstetricians. Dad was telling David about the challenges and rewards of fatherhood, his voice carrying the pride of someone who'd successfully raised 2 daughters and was ready to pass along his accumulated wisdom. Ryan appeared beside me at the railing, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing an expression that was carefully neutral. "Beautiful view," he said, though we both knew he wasn't really talking about the lake. "Your family certainly knows how to make an announcement." I accepted the champagne gratefully, using the moment to organize my thoughts before responding. "Mom's always been good at timing," I said, hearing the dryness in my own voice. "She has a talent for finding the perfect moment to share important news." We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the water and listening to the continued celebration behind us. I was grateful for Ryan's presence, for the way he could offer support without requiring me to explain feelings that I was still sorting through myself. He'd seen enough Martinez family gatherings to understand the dynamics, but this was his first experience of having those dynamics directly impact something that belonged to both of us. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally, his voice gentle enough that I knew he would accept whatever answer I gave him, even if it was that I needed more time to figure it out. The truth was that I was thinking about the acquisition offer from Nexus Media Group, about the numbers that were still so large they didn't feel entirely real, about the validation that came with having a national company recognize the value of what I'd built. I was thinking about how long I'd waited to share that news with my family, how carefully I'd planned to announce it during a moment when they would be gathered together and predisposed to celebrate. I was thinking about the irony of sitting on the biggest professional achievement of my life while watching my family reorganize themselves around someone else's personal milestone. But I was also thinking about something deeper, something that had been building in me for months as I'd navigated the success of my business and the growing recognition within my industry. I was thinking about how little my family actually knew about what I'd accomplished, how their understanding of my work remained limited to vague concepts about computers and marketing, how they'd never asked the kinds of detailed questions that might have revealed the scope of what I was building. It wasn't entirely their fault, I knew. I'd become so accustomed to being the steady, reliable daughter that I'd stopped expecting them to be curious about my ambitions or achievements. I'd settled into a pattern of sharing enough information to keep them informed without overwhelming them with details they didn't seem particularly interested in hearing. But tonight, watching them pivot so completely from celebrating my engagement to planning Tori's pregnancy journey, I realized how much I'd been underestimating the cost of that pattern. "I'm thinking," I told Ryan slowly, "that I might have some news of my own to share tonight." He turned to look at me more directly, and I could see the question in his eyes. We'd talked about the Nexus acquisition, of course. He'd been my closest confidant through the entire negotiation process, helping me think through the implications and celebrating with me when the final contracts were signed. But we'd agreed to keep the news private until I'd had a chance to share it with my family first, and tonight was supposed to be that opportunity. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I mean, I think it's incredible news, and your family should definitely know about it. But are you sure you want to announce it tonight? Right now?" It was a fair question. The practical part of me, the part that had been trained to maintain family harmony and avoid creating conflict, was suggesting that I should wait for another opportunity. Perhaps I could arrange a separate dinner in a few weeks, or find a moment during a regular family gathering when the focus wouldn't be competing with pregnancy news. The responsible approach would be to let Tori have her moment and find my own time to share my achievement. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger over the past few years as I'd built my business and proven my capabilities, was tired of waiting for the perfect moment that never seemed to arrive. I was tired of being the daughter who graciously stepped aside when family attention needed to be redirected elsewhere. I was tired of having achievements that were significant enough to change my entire life trajectory be treated as secondary to other people's personal milestones. Most of all, I was tired of my family not really knowing who I'd become while they weren't paying attention. They still saw me as the dependable daughter who helped organize family events and could be counted on to support Tori through whatever challenge or transition she was navigating. They had no idea that I'd built something substantial, that I'd proven myself in a competitive industry, that I'd achieved the kind of financial success that would give me options they'd never imagined I possessed. "Yes," I told Ryan, feeling a clarity settle over me that was both calming and energizing. "I think tonight is exactly the right time." He nodded slowly, and I could see him shifting into the supportive partner mode that I'd come to depend on over the past 2 years. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Just stand with me," I said. "And maybe be ready to catch me if I completely mess this up." We finished our champagne and walked back toward the main party area, where the celebration was still in full swing. Mom had moved to the center of the gathering and was holding court with stories about her own pregnancy experiences, while Tori sat in a place of honor, glowing with the attention and beginning to look more comfortable with her new status as the family member carrying the next generation. Dad and David were deep in conversation about practical matters, probably discussing everything from health insurance to college savings plans. I waited for a natural lull in the conversation, a moment when the initial excitement had settled enough that people might be ready to shift their attention to something else. It took longer than I expected, because pregnancy news generates the kind of sustained enthusiasm that can carry a conversation for hours. People wanted to share their own experiences, offer advice, speculate about gender and due dates, and generally immerse themselves in the excitement of new life joining the family. Finally, as the catering staff began clearing dinner plates and preparing for the dessert service, I saw my opportunity. The conversation had shifted to logistics, with Mom and Aunt Patricia discussing the timing of baby showers and the coordination required to ensure that Tori received all the support she would need. It was the kind of practical planning discussion that naturally created space for other topics to be introduced. I stood up from my seat at the head table, feeling suddenly aware of every pair of eyes in the pavilion. Ryan rose beside me, his hand finding the small of my back in a gesture of support that gave me the confidence to continue. The photographer, who had been capturing candid moments throughout the evening, seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, and positioned himself where he could document whatever came next. "I hope everyone is enjoying the evening," I began, my voice carrying more clearly than I'd expected across the pavilion. "Ryan and I are so grateful that you could all be here to celebrate with us." The guests settled into attentive silence, probably expecting me to thank them for coming, and perhaps share some details about our wedding plans. I could see Mom and Dad looking at me with the indulgent expressions they wore when they expected me to say something appropriately gracious and brief. Tori was smiling, still glowing from her own announcement and probably anticipating that I would say something sweet about becoming an aunt. "We're also thrilled about Tori's pregnancy news," I continued, nodding toward my sister. "It's wonderful that we have so much to celebrate tonight." More nods and smiles, everyone still expecting the conventional expressions of family joy and mutual support that typically characterized Martina's family gatherings. I could feel my heart rate increasing, not from nervousness exactly, but from the anticipation of sharing something that would fundamentally change how everyone in this pavilion understood my place in the family and my prospects for the future. "Which brings me to some news that I've been waiting for the right moment to share," I said, feeling the energy in the pavilion shift as people realized this might be something more substantial than a simple thank you speech. Ryan's hand pressed slightly more firmly against my back, a reminder that he was with me, and that whatever happened next, we would navigate it together. I could see my parents sitting up straighter, their expressions becoming more focused as they tried to anticipate what kind of announcement their reliable daughter might be preparing to make. Tori looked curious but not concerned, probably assuming that any news I had would be appropriately secondary to her own pregnancy revelation. 3 weeks ago, I continued, my voice gaining strength as I moved toward the revelation that would change everything, I received an offer that I honestly never thought would come my way. Nexus Media Group, a national marketing company, approached me about acquiring my business. I paused there, letting that information settle while I watched the faces in front of me. Some guests nodded politely, not entirely sure what that meant, but understanding that it sounded significant. My parents looked puzzled, probably trying to reconcile the idea of someone wanting to buy my computer work with their understanding of how business acquisitions worked. Tori's expression was shifting from curious to slightly concerned, as if she was beginning to realize that this might be bigger news than she'd anticipated. The negotiations took several weeks, I continued, but the contracts were finalized 2 days ago. They purchased Amplified Digital Marketing for $2.4 million. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced at a Martinez family gathering. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of people processing good news, but rather the stunned silence of people trying to understand information that didn't fit with their existing assumptions about reality. I could see Mom's mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to form words that wouldn't come. Dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something between pride and disbelief and confusion. Ryan began to applaud, his clapping slow and deliberate in the complete silence. Gradually, a few other guests joined in, though their applause was tentative, as if they weren't entirely sure what they were celebrating. Sam Williams, my college friend who understood the tech industry, was grinning broadly and clapping enthusiastically. Marcus Johnson, my business partner who had been part of the negotiation process, was nodding approvingly from his table near the back. But it was my family's reaction that held my attention. Mom was still processing, her face cycling through expressions of surprise, confusion, and something that might have been pride. Dad was doing mental calculations, I could tell, trying to understand what this meant in practical terms. Tori was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time in her life. $2.4 million? Dad finally managed to say, his voice carrying across the pavilion in the continued silence. After taxes and fees, it's just over $1.8 million, I clarified. Plus, I'm staying on as Director of Innovation at a salary of $250,000 annually. The number hung in the air like a challenge to everything my family thought they knew about me. $2.4 million. Even saying it out loud felt surreal, like I was discussing someone else's life rather than my own. I watched as the guests processed this information, their faces reflecting varying degrees of surprise, admiration, and in some cases, what looked like reevaluation of who they thought Jessica Martinez actually was. Helen Thompson, Ryan's mother, was the first to break through the stunned silence with genuine enthusiasm. "Jessica, that's absolutely incredible," she exclaimed, rising from her seat to embrace me. "We had no idea your business had grown to that level. What an amazing achievement." Her response seemed to give others permission to react, and gradually the pavilion filled with congratulations and questions about how I'd built something so valuable. But even as I accepted the well wishes from friends and extended family, my attention remained focused on the core Martinez family table. Mom was still sitting in what appeared to be shocked silence, her champagne glass untouched in front of her as she stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Dad had moved past his initial surprise and was now leaning forward with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for major financial decisions, clearly trying to understand the implications of what I'd just revealed. Tori's reaction was the most complex to read. She was smiling, but it was the careful smile she wore when she was processing information that affected her, but that she didn't fully understand yet. David was congratulating me enthusiastically, asking technical questions about the acquisition process that suggested he had a better grasp of business transactions than the rest of my family. But I could see Tori calculating something in her head, the way she always did when family dynamics shifted in ways that might impact her position. Uncle Michael approached our table with a broad grin and a firm handshake. "Jessica, I had no idea you were running such a successful operation," he said with genuine warmth. "I mean, we knew you were doing well with your marketing work, but this is extraordinary. You should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." His words highlighted something that had become increasingly clear to me over the past few years. Even the family members who were supportive and well-meaning had fundamentally misunderstood the scope and significance of what I'd been building. They'd categorized my work as doing well, in the same way they might describe someone who had gotten a nice promotion or found a stable job with good benefits. The idea that I'd created something valuable enough to attract a multi-million-dollar acquisition offer simply hadn't been within their frame of reference for what Jessica Martinez might achieve. Aunt Patricia was asking detailed questions about how the acquisition would work, whether I'd continue running the company, and what kinds of opportunities this might open up for me in the future. Her curiosity seemed genuine, and I found myself appreciating the way she was treating my news as something worthy of sustained attention, rather than a brief acknowledgement before moving on to other topics. Meanwhile, Cousin Ashley was clearly struggling to reconcile this information with her existing understanding of family roles and hierarchies. She kept glancing between Tori and me as if she was trying to figure out how these two major announcements fit together and what they meant for the family's future dynamics. I could almost see her mental calculations as she tried to determine whether my financial success somehow diminished the significance of Tori's pregnancy, or whether both pieces of news could coexist without creating tension. The most revealing reactions came from family friends and neighbors who had known me since childhood. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door to my parents and had watched both Tori and me grow up, approached me with tears in her eyes. "Jessica, I remember when you were in high school, always so focused and determined," she said. "Your parents used to worry that you were too serious, that you needed to have more fun like your sister, but look what that determination has created. You should be so proud." Her comment hit me with unexpected force because it captured something I'd been feeling, but hadn't been able to articulate. Throughout my childhood and young adulthood, my seriousness and focus had often been treated as character traits that needed to be corrected, rather than strengths that might lead somewhere significant. While Tori's social ease and spontaneity were celebrated as positive qualities, my tendency toward goal setting and systematic effort was viewed with mild concern, as if dedication to achievement was somehow unhealthy or unbalanced. Now, standing in the pavilion with the reality of my success finally visible to everyone who'd known me since childhood, I was beginning to understand how much those early messages had shaped my relationship with my own ambitions. I'd learned to downplay my achievements and minimize my goals because drawing too much attention to them felt somehow inappropriate for the role I'd been assigned within the family structure. Ryan appeared at my side with fresh champagne and the kind of proud smile that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Unlike my family, he'd been present for the entire journey of building my business, celebrating small victories along the way and understanding how each client's success and strategic breakthrough had contributed to creating something valuable. He'd never needed me to explain or justify my professional ambitions because he'd seen them as natural extensions of who I was, rather than departures from who I was supposed to be. "How does it feel to finally be able to share this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the ongoing conversations around us. The question made me pause and actually consider my emotional state, which had been so focused on managing family reactions that I hadn't paid much attention to my own feelings about this moment. How did it feel? Relief was part of it, certainly. I'd been carrying this news for weeks, and the weight of keeping such significant information private had been more substantial than I'd realized. But there was also something deeper, something that felt like vindication for years of choices that had been questioned or dismissed. "It feels like proof," I said finally. Proof that all those nights working late and weekends spent building proposals and risks that seemed too big actually added up to something meaningful. Before Ryan could respond, Mom finally approached us, her expression still reflecting the shock of what she just learned. "Jessica, honey, I don't even know what to say," she began, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and confusion. "I mean, I knew your business was doing well, but I had no idea it was worth that kind of money. How long has this been happening? When did it get so big?" Her questions revealed the depth of the disconnect between my actual professional life and my family's understanding of it. The truth was that my business had been growing substantially for over 2 years, with revenue increasing dramatically as I'd expanded my client base and developed more sophisticated service offerings. But because I'd never found ways to translate those achievements into terms that resonated with my family's experience, they'd remained largely invisible to the people who mattered most to me. "It's been building gradually," I explained, trying to find language that would help her understand the trajectory without overwhelming her with technical details. The breakthrough really came when I started working with tech startups and helped several of them achieve major growth. Word spread in that community, and larger companies began approaching me for similar services. Nexus had been watching my work for over a year before they made the acquisition offer. Dad joined our conversation, and I could see him trying to shift into the practical mindset that had served him well throughout his construction career. "So what does this mean exactly?" he asked. "Do you still own the company, or do they own it now? And what about your employees? Do they keep their jobs?" His questions demonstrated the kind of detailed thinking that had made him successful in his own field, and I appreciated that he was trying to understand the implications rather than just being impressed by the dollar amount. I explained how the acquisition structure worked, how my team would be integrated into Nexus's larger organization, and how my new role would allow me to expand the work I'd been doing while having access to resources and support systems that would have taken me years to develop independently. As we talked, I became aware that other conversations around the pavilion had shifted as well. Tables that had been discussing baby plans and pregnancy advice were now buzzing with questions about entrepreneurship and business development. Several of Ryan's relatives were asking him about my company and what kinds of services I provided, clearly trying to understand how someone they'd categorized as the quiet sister had built something so valuable. The photographer had been documenting these interactions, and I realized that the evening's visual narrative had fundamentally changed from what either Ryan or I had originally envisioned. Instead of photos capturing an engagement celebration followed by a surprise pregnancy announcement, we now had documentation of a much more complex family gathering, where 2 major life changes had been revealed simultaneously, creating a dynamic that none of us had experienced before. Tori finally approached me directly, her expression warmer than I'd expected given how completely my news had redirected attention away from her pregnancy announcement. "Jess, this is amazing," she said, and her voice carried what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but this is really incredible. I had no idea you were building something this big." Her response surprised me, because I'd been bracing for some level of resentment or competition, given how dramatically the evening's focus had shifted. But Tori seemed genuinely pleased, perhaps because she was secure enough in her own news to appreciate mine without feeling threatened by it. Or perhaps because she was beginning to understand that my financial success might actually create opportunities for the entire family, rather than diminishing her own significance within it. "Thank you," I said, feeling a wave of affection for my sister that reminded me why, despite all our differences and the family dynamics that sometimes created tension between us, I genuinely wanted her to be happy and successful in her own right. "I'm excited about your pregnancy too. It's going to be amazing to become an aunt." We hugged, and for a moment the pavilion felt like what I'd originally hoped this evening would be. A gathering of people who cared about each other, celebrating multiple reasons for optimism about the future. But even as I enjoyed that feeling, I was aware that the real test of how my family would respond to this news would come in the days and weeks ahead, when they'd had time to fully process the implications of what I'd achieved and what it might mean for all of us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.